Good morning, everybody. I think we're just waiting for people to come through from the waiting room. Okay, I think we're starting to get quite a few people through, so I'm going to kick off. Good morning to everyone. Real pleasure to have you here on this webinar today. I am Lisa Bertelsen. I'm Executive Director of Public Affairs here at CBBC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which focuses on energy transition. It's the first in a series of 5 webinars we will run exploring the official themes of the UK's presidency of COP26, which, as everybody knows, will take place in the beginning of November in Glasgow. Our focus is not only where UK and China have been working together, but more importantly, where we continue to work together in tackling the climate crisis, including in particular looking at what future business opportunities there are. CBBC is compiling a report in partnership with KPMG and other sponsors, including Wood, who are sponsoring the chapter on energy transition. So thank you to all of them. The report will be launched at the COP26 meeting, and our aim is to showcase examples of UK and Chinese companies working together in this area. Today, we've got excellent representation from such companies to discuss the urgent need for us to embark upon this much talked about energy transition, which is, you all know, a huge topic. So we can only cover 2 aspects today. The first is decarbonisation, and then we're going to move on to offshore wind investment. Now, as to format, we're going to work through sort of 2 sessions. Each one will have short presentations by each of our speakers. But please do start. I can see my colleague has already said, you know, put the questions you have, start thinking of questions and putting those questions into the Q&A box from the beginning, and we will pick them up and answer them during the discussion, which we'll have at the end of all the presentations. So please do start putting the questions into the Q&A box now, and then we'll pick them up. So moving along, the climate crisis obviously is forcing cities, regions, companies to develop an energy transition strategy. So first of all, I'd like to invite Dan Carter, Global Head of Decarbonisation at Wood, to set the scene and talk about how they are developing strategies and support, particularly using, for example, their SCORE methodology. So Dan, over to you. If I can ask you to open your camera. There you go, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Reese. So let's see if I can figure out the logistics to start sharing my presentation.
There we go.
Great, so hopefully you'll be able to see that. So I wanted to take some time this morning to set the scene and look at the main drivers for decarbonisation and some of the methodologies that we can deploy when we're thinking about how we embark on this journey, whatever our goals may be in terms of meeting net zero. So first of all, drivers. The progress since the Paris Agreement has not been enough, really, globally. An unprecedented effort is now required to cut levels of emissions and get back on track. Obviously, the deadline there was looking at net zero across the business by 2050. China has set its own goal for 2060, respecting its historical emissions and its contribution to greenhouse gas in the past. So out of all of these emissions, energy, heat production, and industrial processes account for more than half of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously they're a really important area to focus on when we're looking at cutting or meeting those greenhouse gas emissions targets. We're also starting to see more and more interest in decarbonisation goals from a sustainability or ESG perspective from the financial community. So fund managers now see companies that are not responding to climate change related risks as unattractive investment. And actually the interest from those investors is now forcing organisations to adopt green goals. So as a result of that, nearly half of the world's GDP is now covered by net zero targets. It's also, I think, important to note that from some recent analysis, companies are risking more than $2.2 trillion by 2030 if they base their investments on current emissions policies during the low carbon transition, rather than looking towards the future and how those policies may evolve. So the final word on this slide is that 45% of decarbonisation goals can also be tackled through better adoption of the circular economy. So more focus on reusing, repairing and recycling the products that we use every day. So decarbonisation is quite a complicated journey. There are lots of drivers, there are also lots of potential solutions. So how do we go about organising our processes to be able to address that challenge in a structured manner and ultimately to be able to realise the goals we set for ourselves? Firstly, we need a roadmap. So we need to decide how we are going to proceed from today through to our net zero endpoint and what interim goals we are going to set on that journey. In order to do that, we also need access to data. We need to understand what our carbon footprint looks like today. We need to understand what our major emissions sources are to be able to start investigating how we can abate and reduce those. We also need to make smart decisions. We need tools to enable us to make those decisions in a sustainable manner. Importantly, making sure that the decisions that we take today are on the roadmap to our longer term objectives and they don't represent any regret investment. So how do we do this? How do we create our roadmap to meeting our carbon commitments? Well, we've pulled together a process that really focuses around three main pillars. Firstly is the advisory stage. So this is really about getting started, baselining your carbon emissions and footprint where you are today and setting targets in terms of how they will be achieved. Secondly, assessments. So starting to look at the right opportunities and the projects, screening a long list of opportunities to reduce our carbon emissions, putting in place a structured process to decide which ones are the right path forward for our particular asset, our business, our geography. And then once we have that roadmap, delivering on it. So deploying solutions through engineering, project management, construction, but also putting in place processes to better monitor those CO2 or those greenhouse gas emissions to make sure that the reductions we've achieved are sustained for the long term and actually can be implemented upon further as well. So if we look at Wood's score process in a little bit more detail, what does it mean? So first of all, back to that advisory stage. So it's understanding the objectives and the corporate strategy from the business. It's understanding how policy can impact on that particular organisation or those assets today, but also looking at scenarios for how policy will evolve moving into the future. And it's also looking at the market. If we take something like a combined cycle gas turbine plant producing power, our goal there might just be to reduce carbon emissions from that particular asset. If, however, we have something like an oil refinery, we're also seeing a changing market environment around the demand for high carbon intensity transport fuels that is also going to impact on our future market and our business opportunities as a refiner. So we need to take all of this into account when we look at setting our targets and our priorities for decarbonisation. Once we've set our goals, and those goals could be an ultimate net zero goal against a time horizon, they could be set in incremental steps in order to achieve that. We need to look at how we're going to get there. So really we see opportunities based around four main categories. So first off is substitution. For example, substituting sources of power for renewable alternatives, potentially substituting feedstock for bio alternatives. Secondly, we have carbon capture, but understanding where the opportunities exist for carbon capture and the logistics of that carbon throughout the value chain, so how it will be transported and then either used or stored. We can also look at offsetting strategies, and what we really mean here is looking at prioritising our investment in decarbonisation strategies based on our asset portfolio or our product portfolio. but also looking at things like natural climate solutions and investment that can help us to offset any remaining carbon emissions after we've taken implementable and technologically feasible steps to reduce that carbon footprint. And lastly, but what we should probably look at first is reducing our CO2 emissions to start off with. So making sure our assets are operated in an energy efficient manner, minimizing the fuel we consume, and therefore minimizing the CO2 or greenhouse gas we produce. And we can screen all of these opportunities on a techno-economic basis, so looking at cost estimates, economic and financial analysis linked back into impacts of things like policy and potentially policy impacts on carbon credits or penalties, but also bringing in some other measures. For example, we may have an asset that we think is particularly vulnerable to the risks of climate change. Does investing in that asset now to reduce its own carbon footprint help us to defer or avoid later capital expenditure that might be far in excess of particular projects we're looking at to achieve our decarbonisation goals? Also things like the TCFD score of the company or organisation, and how does it fit with the company's overall ESG goals from a holistic perspective. And then finally, the delivery phase, so taking those projects to design, implementation processes, and as I mentioned before, monitoring the output. So how do we look at this? Well, in a number of cases, decarbonisation investments are really stay in business. They're looking at the future of our planet, our people, our assets, and our organisations. So it's important that we consider how we can implement our decarbonisation goals in the most capital efficient way. And what we've seen in the UK and elsewhere around Europe is the development of industrial clusters. These industrial clusters are really anchor projects. They're designed to demonstrate technology at scale, for example, carbon capture technology, the production of blue or green hydrogen, but also start to put in place the infrastructure required to be able to transport that CO2, transport that hydrogen, and to be able to sequester and store it for the long term. Just run quickly through some of these. So Net Zero Teesside is one of the anchor projects we've worked on within Wood. It's a new dispatchable combined cycle gas turbine power plant fitted with 95% carbon capture. It also looks at retrofitting carbon capture to some of the existing assets within the Teesside area and putting in place the CO2 gathering network and the compression stations to take that then offshore for long-term storage in the Endurance aquifer. So roadmap project for the northeast of England. The Scottish Net Zero Roadmap is very similar. This is developing a roadmap for decarbonisation of the northeastern part of Scotland. It accesses UK government funding support. It's closely aligned but also independent of the Acorn project at St Fergus, which is another anchor project for the development of carbon capture technology and hydrogen production technology. Within Wood, we are looking at the production and distribution for hydrogen, and hydrogen to be used as a replacement industrial or domestic source of fuel. And that net zero roadmap is continuing in development and will continue throughout 2022. And lastly, Humber Zero. So again, another large industrial cluster within the northeast of the UK. This particular one is looking at how to best efficiently design a decarbonisation pathway for a cluster that consists of an oil refinery and a combined heat and power plant. So again, looking back to that SCORE methodology, looking at a number of options around pre-combustion capture, potentially fuel switching, so switching out refinery fuel gas for hydrogen as in some of the refinery process units, applying post-combustion capture and CO2 transportation and sequestration where that post-combustion capture makes sense. And then also looking again at blue and green hydrogen generation options as a future fuel for both industry and domestic application within the northeast. And this particular project will reduce CO2 emissions by around 8 million tonnes per annum. So we believe that industrial clusters are really key to moving the decarbonisation and net zero agenda forward in a way that's robust, minimises capex, and also puts in place their infrastructure requirements, working with government to be able to other organisations, other companies to link into that infrastructure to be able to realise their own industrial goals. So that's it from me first thing this morning. I look forward to taking any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was really helpful, and look forward, please. Oh, we've got Q&A starting to come in now. Thank you for that. And we will go forward now into our next presentation. So Dan, if I can ask you to close down your camera and your microphone, then we will move on. The need for transition, I think, is evident in cities as well as companies, and it's particularly in those cities where economic foundations relied heavily on conventional energy intensive sources. And one of those cities that is working hard to transition is Aberdeen. So I'm going to hand over to Barney Crockett, who is Aberdeen's Lord Provost, and he's also currently president of the World Energy Cities Partnership, which includes 3 Chinese cities, Dongying, Daqing, and Karamay. So, Barney, over to you if you would like to open up your camera. Oh, and do ask questions, everybody. Do ask questions.
It's the host has stopped me, it says. So, yeah, good.
There we go. We now have you, Barney.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So as you heard, I'm Barney Crockett. I'm the Lord Provost of Aberdeen, which is a sort of grand title of mayor and also the Queen's representative in Aberdeen. And as you heard, I'm also currently the president of the World Energy Cities Partnership, working very closely with cities across the world, and most particularly those in China that you just heard listed. We are a very small city, but a very industrial advanced and an energy city that's trying to embrace the energy transition. So for the next slide, please. So you see a map of us there. We're a tiny country, and we're a tiny city in that tiny country, if you compared to China. A population of 229,000, but the energy capital of Europe, the biggest intensity of energy companies of anywhere in Europe, and also people who work right across the world from the city. And I think it's important to say that Aberdonians have always worked right across the world, or for many, many years, including very much in China. We have very long links to China, especially training doctors, both in Aberdeen for China and also in China. We've 50 years experience of oil and gas, but we've set ourselves the goal of being very much to the fore in changing energy. And you can see maybe one thing that we're quite well placed for offshore wind, which will feature later in your conversations today, but we're the centre for the UK offshore wind industry, amongst other things. Next slide, please. So that we're a pioneering hydrogen city. With one of the themes that we chose very early on was to have some speciality in hydrogen, and we've taken that forward. We are Europe's largest real-world deployment of hydrogen vehicles. We have 65 at the moment, and that will soon go up to 100. And we have, in particular, a very wide range of vehicles. So we've Europe's largest bus fleet of hydrogen buses, but we also have street cleaning vehicles. We'll soon be getting waste collection vehicles. We have cars and vans. And I think one thing is that we work with companies from all over the world, that we're not restricted to Europe, we're not restricted to the UK. We embrace companies from everywhere in the world, and that very much includes China. We're also working to try, these figures will seem very small in the context of China, but we're working hard to be able to produce hydrogen in large quantities that we can use to fuel our energy transfer, but also perhaps export hydrogen to other places, perhaps even including China. We have had some interest in transferring hydrogen across the Northern Passage from Northern Europe to North Asia. Next slide, please. You see there a wee picture of a city in transition, a city that's changing rapidly. On the upper left, that's our conference and exhibition center that features a wide range of energy conferences. And I would warmly welcome people from China to take part. I think one of the great things about the UK in energy is that it is very open to the world. It's not like some countries that are very protective. It's a place that anybody can engage in competition. Any company can take its place. And, you know, we very much hope we have 1,000 international oil and gas companies operating in Aberdeen at the moment, 1,000 companies from outside the UK, including, for example, 100 from Norway. But, you know, so Chinese companies will be very welcome to join in that. You see our refueling station in the upper right hand. That's one of our 2 refueling stations, the only 2 currently operating in Scotland. And it's had a very warm public reception. Sometimes people are anxious about energy changes, anxious about hydrogen. This is very much in the middle of our city and is a popular place for people to visit and learn about technology. I mentioned offshore wind. The wind turbines you see there in the picture are actually just off the harbour of Aberdeen. So we have a deployment test centre there for Europe, featuring Europe's most powerful turbines, and they're within visible sight of my office here. We also, for example, are building a new harbour. In many places in Europe are moving harbours out of cities. We are building a new harbour to complement our existing busy harbour inside our city, with the hope of worldwide exchanges of goods through that, featuring energy and in particular the decarbonisation agenda. Again, you see a little picture there, picture of our range of vehicles. You'll notice that they're all themed. All the hydrogen vehicles that we operate in the city all have the same livery, the same look, the same logos, so that we get the message over about hydrogen. Next slide, please. There you see a map showing the World Energy Cities Partnership. We're a very dynamic organization featuring most of the world's cities that lead in the traditional energy world of oil and gas, but also now to power change. So we originally were mainly cities in oil and gas, but we're now driving forward, all of them embracing that agenda of change, not least our partners in China that you heard mentioned there. And we're always looking for new centers of dynamism and change to join us. We'll soon be joined by, we've been joined just now by a city in Korea. So we are always looking for new partners as well in that. And as I said, most of the countries, most of the cities, they have a background in oil and gas, but all of them have very much a drive to lead the world in energy change. Next slide, please. You see there a little bit about Aberdeen and China. I think that we have very strong cooperation academically. Our universities are very highly rated, and in particular are highly rated by students. There's 2 universities in Aberdeen, and both of them are in the top 10 in Britain for student contentment with their courses. Students feel they benefit them, and our courses tend to be very, very work related. We've always had a high number of Chinese students for many years. And as mentioned, I touched on there that we've had, you know, many years ago, we had Chinese students studying medicine, and we helped people from Aberdeen helped to train China's first modern doctors in Hong Kong. And we trained, amongst other things, the leader of China, Sun Yat-sen. And Aberdonians, Sun Yat-sen was kidnapped in Britain, and it was Aberdonians who managed to get him freed. So we played a small role in China's history. And we look, you know, forward to telling you more about that. We work with our Chinese partner cities, but we're looking for more partnerships. We're looking for more. I think China is underrepresented amongst our international partners, and we'd be keen to see that rebalanced. and to have a bigger representation of links to China. Thank you very much for listening to my very brief presentation, but I really do hope that I can answer some of your questions. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barney. That's great and useful to have that overview of a city in transition. Now we're going to move back towards business, pivot back towards business. We're talking a lot about close partnerships between the UK and China, and I'm delighted that we have our CBBC board member and president of BP in China, Simon Zhang, to speak from the perspective of a UK company working in China. So Simon, I think, Barney, we're going to switch you off now. I'm going to turn off your camera. And Simon, you're now on.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm trying to share my slides. Can you see this one? I hope you can see.
Yep, we've got you. We need to put you onto slide show, but otherwise you're there. There we go. Great, thank you.
Great. Thank you. I think it's a great opportunity for me to share BP as a company, our journey of the decarbonisation transition, and also in particular what we have started in China. As everybody knows, this decarbonisation is a long journey, and for BP, we have been an international oil company for about 111 years, and now is in the process of transitioning into an integrated energy company. We launched our new strategy globally last year, and with all the details on the 10 aims to achieve by 2030, and also an ambition to become a net zero company by 2050. So I listed here the 10 aims that our company has developed and want to achieve by 2030. I just want to highlight several areas that actually China can play a big role into that. Certainly, the first one area is in terms of the investment opportunity into the low carbon renewable energy. And this certainly is an area that we are actively looking into. For China also, it is important in terms of the customer facing areas. We have a target to have electric vehicle charging points by 70,000 by 2030. And actually more than half of that will be achieved in China. And obviously in terms of customer interactions, China will play a big role in terms of retailing business. For China, it is also important, we are looking into hydrogen and CCUS opportunities as well. So these are the areas that we will continue to look into. And lastly is also on the city solutions. So for BP, we have targeted to have 10 to 15 cities to establish partnerships by 2030, and China will play a big role in that. Just want to recap in terms of what we have achieved last year, 1 year. So basically over the past 1 year, what we have achieved since we announced our strategy. In terms of our renewable energies, we have been really focusing on solar and wind. In the pipeline, we now have 21 gigawatts. And half of that actually has been developed last year, over the past 12 months. And then in terms of quite complicated industry clusters development. So these are the areas mainly we need quite a lot of partnerships. And we started to do that. As mentioned earlier in Wood's presentation, talks about the T-side opportunity. And really this is one of the projects that BP is participating in as well as a leading operator that we will work with the other partners to deliver. And also in terms of city solutions, we have partnered with Aberdeen as well as Houston. So it is great that Lord Barnett has shared with us what is happening in Aberdeen. And really BP is very much happy to have the partnership with the city. Now let's talk a bit about China. For China, one of the key milestones that I think that it is very important to highlight is in terms of the 3060 pledge that was announced last year. This is really a milestone, and what we have been seeing is that since then there are a lot of great developments, and especially on planning areas with the government on the 14th five-year plan that has been implementing in terms of low carbon projects and also plans. For BP, we actually have been in China for more than 40 years. And on the low carbon journey, one of the areas that we have always been thinking about is what really a multinational company can offer to support China's decarbonization journey. So I've listed here over the past maybe 20 years, what are the relevant projects that we have been doing. Some are successful, some are not so successful, but really provide great learnings for us. So I tried to list it all the relevant projects or commercialization projects that we have been doing. And I tried to summarize some of the themes through the experiences of the past 20 years. First is I think that there is always a technology breakthrough element. So through our collaboration with two universities and the research institute, one is the Dalian Institute of Chemical Physics under the China Academy of Science, and the other one is Tsinghua University. So really the cooperation with them in terms of looking into the technologies in the wider low carbon areas, and also looking into the models on the roadmaps and the planning tools models. So these are the areas that we do think that are important. And also I think some of the early tests, because low carbon journey is so complicated and therefore people need to do tests. And some of the tests that we actually started, well, we did it 15 years ago. Although it was not so successful due to various reasons, it could be the value chain is not ready, the policies are not ready. But however, these experiences would inform the new plans that we are having. And we did some in the solar, and also we have the first hydrogen filling station in the Summer Olympics we had in 2008 in Beijing. So these are the experiences that we had, and also informed us to form real materialized commercialization projects as we are having right now on the electric vehicle charging, as we have the joint venture now in China. And the third area I really think it's important is in terms of the global expertise, best practices sharing. And one of the areas that we have been looking into is in terms of the carbon trading area. We know that China has launched this emission trading system for the power industry just recently. And there are 7 other industries are doing the testing. And our trading team has been cooperating and working on these. So international experience, we do think that are important. And then lastly, of course, is in terms of the partnerships. That is also important to help us looking into working with Chinese partners to really deliver the low carbon journey. And lastly, then it is what we are doing now and for the future. As I said that this is a long journey, and therefore we have just started. Since last year when we published our new strategy, and for the China organization that we have did a reorganization as well. Apart from the traditional business lines that we'll be having, like the low carbon energy, electricity, convenience mobility, and the resilient and focused hydrocarbon business. But I think that really what is important is in terms of the integrators and enablers that we have established in our organization as well. Like the one that we have listed below, the 3 horizontal bars. So these are the areas we think it is important when we are working with partners, and to, especially when we're trying to get into more complicated industry clusters, or in China, it is talking about industrial parks. So how to having pulled together the best of the company, as well as with the partners to develop opportunities, are the key ones that we are focusing on. So with partners, we have been working both with the traditional and the long-term partners that we are having, like the three national oil companies. We're also looking into new business partners, like in the digital areas. And I also think that there will be an innovation element that we are focusing on as well. This will be the area that we are investing into new digital and innovation areas, and so that can inform our future plan. So I just want to highlight is that China is a huge market, and therefore it is important for BP to deliver our low carbon strategy. And also, in the meantime, it is important to sharing best practice. And I do think that in this area, multinational companies do have a role to play. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that I can answer some of the questions in the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for that really helpful presentation. I'm going to ask Barney and Dan to switch on their cameras again so that we can have a kind of vaguely a virtual panel. Always fun these days. And we're going to answer some of your questions. I'm going to use the moderator's privilege, if you like, just to ask, because I'm curious. I mean, both actually, this is both you and both Simon and Dan. Obviously, China and the UK have very different industrial strategies, foundations, and cultures. Dan, from a wood point of view, how does the decarbonisation strategy for the UK, how can that work, your experience in China? And Simon, as a company that's been working, as you told us, for so many years and working with so many partners, how do you manage this side of things? So Dan, I'll come to you first.
Thanks. I think really the that can be applied from the work that's been done so far in the UK is really focusing on collaboration. So collaboration between those that are producing the CO2 emissions, the technology developers and the governments to work together to find the best solution forward for meeting China's decarbonisation goals. And a lot of it is about shared infrastructure, shared investment, but admittedly, it does create some issues that we need to manage in terms of managing all stakeholders to make sure everyone is fairly treated and involved.
Yeah, I think that's a really big issue. Simon, how about you from the BP perspective of so many years?
Right, so I think first that there are quite a lot of common things that can actually be shared across globally. Technology is one of them, and certainly in these areas, as I mentioned, in some areas that we have already partnering with the Chinese Design Institute, and therefore the areas I think that in the wider space, especially when we are talking about digitalization, these are the enablers and will help in the industry. And in these areas, China really are in quite many areas are in the front running areas. So therefore, we can jointly develop and invest. And I think that in terms of the materialization of the commercial opportunities, it is important to look into the policy element as well. And therefore, there will be a global sharing in terms of what are the best practices and the tests even in some countries, and that could be shared. Also, I think that mentioned a bit, Danny mentioned about industry cluster. And these areas are the same concept when we are doing the industrial parks development in China. So I do think that, as Danny has mentioned, collaboration, co-investment, and also looking into the joint development of the future technology could be one of them. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Design institutes are really important still, aren't they, in this process, presumably? Yeah, so that's something which people really need to and CBBC, we've done a lot around this. So yeah, interesting point. We've actually had a question around carbon capture, utilization and storage. I think that's really to all three of you. How advanced and effective do you think it's been so far? Should we come to, actually, Barney, do you want to pick that one up first? And then we'll do Simon and then Dan.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I have a very long history in carbon capture because I was on the development company 30 years ago that started thinking about carbon capture in the North Sea. So that maybe helps to answer the question, is that progress has been very slow. However, I think that what is going to happen is that it's going to really arrive with quite a rush. It's been a very, very long time to wait to get things going. But I think that it will be pushed forward. The political pressures are there. Daniel mentioned the pressure from shareholders, the pressure from corporations that hold shares in companies. They're pushing for change. And in particular, I think that the mayors in cities are pushing for dramatic change, and that will lead to a sudden expansion of carbon capture. Now, whether in the long term it will be on the largest scale and be a major part of solutions, we don't know. But we know we have to try an awful lot of things before we find the solutions that are going to work across the world. But the pressure is there. The pressure is there from people, and the pressure is there from in particular the cities.
Thank you, Simon.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with Lord Crockett in terms of the realization, the commercialization is slow. I just want to touch on one side on the technology. I know that actually in China, the 3 oil companies have been doing quite a lot of tests on these areas as well on CCUS. And obviously, multinational companies like BP have also done that. So these are the areas, of course, on the technical exchange. It is one of the areas I think that will be important, especially if there are joint projects that these companies could be having, and that can certainly create a channel to share the best practices. I think the second one is really how to materialize these things in a sensible way that commercially can work. This could be an area certainly need the government support. And in the US, for instance, there are policy support, and therefore the implementation could be there faster than the other areas. And I do hope that in this regard, China could also having more support from the policy side as well.
I think, yeah, that's an interesting question around government support, and I think one that we're all interested in, both funding-wise, but also policy-wise. I think it's a really good point. Dan, over to you.
So I refer back to, Lord Crockett mentioned, decades of experience in carbon capture, and probably we've both been familiar with some of the same projects in the North Sea, but carbon capture technology isn't something new. It exists today in various parts of the world. The difference is where that CO2 is sequestered today, it's used largely for enhanced oil recovery. What we're talking about is really how to improve the economics of carbon capture and storage by advancing technology to a point where it becomes more affordable. And we're only going to do that as we start to deliver these projects at scales of over 1 million tonnes per annum in terms of each individual capture plant. And we start to see the investment in the technology supported by both government and those technology developers looking towards the next generation of carbon capture.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking that sounds interesting. Actually, that leads me on in a way to another question we've got, which is around the hydrogen side, which we all hear a lot about. And it's not new. The technology is not actually new, is it? Why has it taken this long for us to get there? And maybe that's for Simon and for Dan to answer again. Or maybe also Barney, I don't know if you want to chip in on that one. Please feel free to. Okay, I'm going to go to Simon again now. Simon, off you go.
All right, thank you. So maybe I'll talk a bit about China first, and then you can cover on a global basis. I think for China, certainly on the hydrogen opportunities that people have been talking about, as I mentioned, that BP has doing some testing on the hydrogen, green hydrogen filling opportunities many years ago. The issue is in terms of the industrialization and how to make it green, and also commercialization. In China, we have been looking into quite a lot of government support, talking about a green bus, for instance, hydrogen bus, 10 city, 1,000 buses. These kind of programs are government trying to support from the demand side. On the other side, it is on the supply side, which is currently in. And therefore, there is a difference in terms of gray hydrogen and then using the fossil fuel, and also then getting to green hydrogen. There is a long journey. And in terms of commercialization, how you make it economically viable. And therefore, in terms of planning on these things, needs the industry planning holistically. I think that one, there is a gap there. And therefore, certainly there's a coordinated actions that needs to be done through a whole nation, and also with the 3 oil companies who are the currently biggest player in the fossil fuel hydrogen. That's the angle I'm thinking that in China could look into.
Great, thanks, Simon. Dan, anything from you, Dan?
Yeah, just to add to that, so there are various routes towards hydrogen production. Most hydrogen is today grey from a fossil fuel source. The opportunity exists to add post-combustion or pre-combustion capture to those grey hydrogen facilities to make them blue. And I think that's a viable option for decarbonising many parts of the world where there's already been significant investment in natural gas infrastructure. So you're effectively still using that natural gas as your fuel source, but instead fuel switching to hydrogen, capturing and storing the resulting CO2. Green hydrogen for me is a little bit different, and I think leads back into the discussion around policy. So individual geographies will make their own decisions about how they incentivize renewable energy production versus hydrogen production. Then what do you use that renewable energy for? Do you use it initially to displace high intensity fossil fuel sources of power generation, or do you use it for hydrogen production? And what are your priorities that are driven by your own policy? But it really is about consumption as well. So there needs to be investment in manufacturing capacity for electrolyzers in particular. That investment is only going to be driven if there's the demand for the technology. And we see lots of opportunities around transport where we've got hydrogen hubs, transport networks, but actually that really needs large industrial consumption of hydrogen to make that scale up and deployment a reality, I think.
Right. And that segues us nicely actually then into Barney in a way with the regional side of things in Aberdeen. And
yes, I mean we have, as I mentioned in the presentation, we've got a long history of trying to develop hydrogen. Again, the technical issues are significant, but again, a lot of it is about scale and about determination. So you see a differential between companies that are early, to really push for hydrogen. 1 or 2 of the main car manufacturers have really taken a lead, and they've, probably sustained. They've had to invest a lot of money before they get a real return, but the real return is coming. And so the demand for example, hydrogen vehicles can't be met currently, and companies will respond to that very quickly. I think that we will see, people entering the market with a very big, deep pockets and determined to make change. And I think that will really push things forward. And if I can just say, I see one of the questions cropping up on the list there about smaller companies. I think smaller companies will play a key role in ingenuity in coming up with ways that can use the hydrogen more effectively and more quickly than some of our bigger companies are. Because again, one of the answers to your original question about how long it's taken hydrogen has been, of course, a degree of complacency in the big companies, whether they're energy companies or using companies. An interesting example is a Japanese example, is that Matsushita, the first time ever, they're making energy rather than using it. They're saying this is the signal for change in their company. They're making hydrogen as part of their company plan, not just using energy as all their previous things have done. So I think companies will adapt very quickly once they see the vista opening up.
Right. Thank you. I'm really conscious we've run over our time slot, but I think it was just a really interesting conversation, and I do thank you all. And I think everybody online thanks you for your contributions. Simon, Dan, Bunny, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague James Brodie, who's going to take us into the next session. So thank you once again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hello there, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for moderating that first discussion. And I would, I'm James Brodie. I also work for China Britain Business Council as the Commercial Director for the Industrial Economy. And we've had a really fascinating discussion about the broader picture of decarbonisation just a moment ago, and picking up Wood's own methodology, the SCORE methodology. The first of the acronym stands for substitution, and one of the major sources of new energy, which has been fully commercialized in Europe and indeed in China, is of course offshore wind and wind power more broadly. So we decided to have this dedicate the second section of today's webinar in looking at offshore wind in more detail, and what the deal flow has been between China and the UK and Europe, and no better to take us through that than Adrian Schultz, who's from our principal sponsor KPMG, who's going to he's got a huge amount of experience working with Chinese generation companies coming into the European offshore wind market, and indeed supporting European generators internationally. So Adrian, and I'll pass over to you in a second, and then we're going to have a second presentation just from Mr. Zhang Kaifeng of SDIC, and then I'll moderate a discussion between the two of you. So again, if there's any questions from the audience, please pop them in the chat or the Q&A boxes, and I'll pick them up in our discussion. Over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, James. Hello to everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for joining from all around the world, and I hope you're all well. So I advise clients on energy strategy and M&A across the energy transition, overwhelmingly renewables, and I suppose I've had the enjoyment and pleasure of working on many large offshore wind deals for close to 20 years or so. I suppose I've grown with the industry really from being very nascent around the turn of the century through to being such a scale industry where it is right now, offshore wind, be it fixed and or floating. One of the really important themes, certainly of the last 5 years, maybe a few more, is that when I've been working with clients in Europe, large energy companies around their offshore wind assets, we've been going and talking to partners in Asia, and actually going out on road shows and taking the opportunities to Asia and to China in particular. And both through the work that I've been doing, but also many others as well. We've seen several Chinese companies that have entered and are now participating in the offshore wind sector in Europe. And just to give a few examples, as mentioned, Mr. Zhang will talk about SDIC Power's activities, in particular a business called Red Rock Power, where they actually have an offshore wind development business based in Scotland. So SDIC Power really is the leading light from China to the UK and European offshore wind and broader renewable space. But there are others too. We all know about China General Nucleus, CGN, involvement in Hinkley Point, but it is also a significant renewable energy and also offshore wind strategic participant, and has activities based from an office centered in Paris, but it has activities across Europe in the renewable space, and that includes floating offshore wind in Northwest Europe. China Three Gorges, another big Chinese power company, the clue's in the name, is heavily involved in offshore wind in Europe, both through its participation in EDP and also on a standalone basis. And that includes a project in Scotland, but more broadly across Europe. One more, China Resources, the big Hong Kong-based Chinese state-owned conglomerate, has a power generation subsidiary. It too, in recent years, has come into Europe. But there has been much more interest beyond these. These are, I suppose, the leading headline examples of Chinese companies that have come into Europe. But there are many more that are actively looking, have tried, are pausing, will be looking. So there's generally, I would say, a strong drumbeat of teams working away in Chinese organizations, often in China, but then sometimes they have operations that are being set up in the UK or in Europe, actively looking to develop their activities. Just quickly, I would say it's not just China coming from Asia across to Europe. It's also very interesting that I've seen large companies from Southeast Asia, from Taiwan, Thailand, from Malaysia, but also from Japan, both financial and strategic investors, and also from South Korea. So there's been a lot of general appetite coming across, but really for very different reasons in many instances. I would really say that the Chinese companies are coming for a set of reasons, and I suppose it's been borne out in some of the results. It's resulted in, I would say, really strong relationships and partnerships that have been set up. For example, China Resources with Equinor, or China General Nuclear with EDP, and that is extending into the offshore wind space. Also learning, but not just learning around the asset itself, but learning about for Chinese companies, how to set themselves up to transact globally, to partner globally, capital flows that are happening more globally. So there's been a lot of learning from that perspective. Interestingly, it hasn't resulted so far in Chinese offshore wind turbines coming across to Europe. Whether that happens in the future, who knows? I mean, I'll come on to a theme about the globalization of offshore wind shortly, but that hasn't happened so far. It's more been around asset partnership and building those relationships and those learnings. So what does this mean for the future? Well, a few quick themes if I look forward, just personal perspectives. Offshore wind is certainly globalizing. Just one anecdote, speaking with a board member of I would say a major European energy company, a major in offshore wind. I think over the next 12 months, their team is bidding into at least 8, if not double-digit, major, potentially gigawatt scale auctions in offshore wind across 3 continents. Multiple East Asian markets, European markets, and then North America as well. So there is a serious scale, both of complexity, capital, capability that is building just in offshore wind. And therefore, what I am starting to see, what we're starting to see with some of these energy companies, it's so big that I think the jury is right, rightly or wrongly. Offshore wind is becoming a standalone business within these organisations. Ørsted runs offshore wind very much as its own pillar, aside from onshore renewables. RWE just made an announcement in recent days that it's possibly splitting its renewables business into offshore wind and then probably onshore. Or the likes of EDPR and ENGIE pooling their offshore wind resources together. So there will definitely be a consolidation because you can only have so many major players with that level of scale. So I suppose bringing that to Chinese companies and how they operate, really this is a massive opportunity, especially as the Chinese offshore wind market is really building momentum now. But it's also a decision, it's an opportunity, but it requires a serious decision to what extent Chinese state gencos will be participating in this. And that would require a significant upping of the momentum that's happened over the last few years and a question of continued globalization. So it's just simply a question of when and how these partnerships continue to develop between China and UK and broader European energy companies in this really exciting, growing, scale, consolidating sector over the next few years. That just concludes a few perspectives that I wanted to share, James, and look forward to continuing the discussion with Mr. Zhang.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant starter to set the scene, and as you mentioned, SDIC, I've been one of the sort of front runners in those Chinese gencos coming into Europe, and I've actually already, got a significant presence in the sector here. So now we'll hear from Mr. Zhang about Red Rock Power in particular, and then we'll break to a three-way discussion to tease out some of those trends that you alluded to there, Adrian. Over to you, Mr. Zhang. I think we can see you, and I can see some slides. Do we have? Do you have some slides as well?
Yeah, yes, of
Shane,
course. Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Yes.
I will share my screen. I will find the button. Okay.
So Mr. Zhang is the chair of Red Rock Power in Scotland, and he's also the deputy general manager for SDIC Power in their Beijing headquarters.
Well, okay. There's some technical problem for myself share my content because I don't know how to share the screen.
Okay, I think so we can
yes, you can
share them on your behalf.
Yes, maybe you can share the materials.
Just bear with us a moment. We'll get your slides.
Yeah, so Anna's just going to share the slides.
Great.
好的，我看到屏幕了，大家也能看到，我相信。好的，非常高兴能够参加这样的一次这个网上举办的这个交流会。那么的话呢，我在这里花上大约5到6分钟的时间的话呢，把我们国投电力在海外业务的这个，特别是在英国的这个新能源业务的话呢，给大家做一个介绍。下一页，谢谢。Next please. Next please. 我们是一家在中国和在伦敦两地上市的上市公司。那么我们过去的这个业务的话呢，一直处于高速的发展之中。在2014年之前的话呢，我们的主要业务是在中国的国内。那么从2014年开始，我们就开始逐渐的走向了这个全球。那么简单来说的话呢，就是我们公司的这个投资理念是非常绿色的，目前在我们的投资组合里头有超过2/3的这个装机都是绿色的装机，它们主要来自于水电、风电以及这个光伏发电。那么这个也是我给大家的这个主题，这个主要的这个 keyword， 也就是说我们是非常绿色的一家能源投资公司。那么我们从英国的业务是从2016年我们收购了这个Repsol， 也就是西班牙石油公司的这个在英国的一个平台公司。那么他们拥有2个海上风电的股权，其中有一个是25%的股权，一个是100%的股权。那么的话呢，开始了我们在英国的这个绿色能源投资。下一页，谢谢。那么在这一页的话呢，我想给大家展示的就是我们目前国投电力的这个国际业务的这个全景。应该说我们这一页想告诉大家的或者传递出来的信息，就是我们在这个英国从2016年我们落地以后，那么我们是处于不断的发展中的。我们在2016年并购了2个海上风电以后，那么我们在2018年我们又并购了1个陆上的风电。那么在2020年这个疫情期间，那么我们不仅仅交割了一个在位于瑞典的一个241兆瓦的一个陆上风电，同时的话呢，我们还涉足到了 这个项目的前期，我们还在我们苏格兰地区并购了一个这个处于前期建设阶段的这个陆上风电项目。那么同时的话呢，我们在东南亚地区，我们也是投资了这个垃圾发电，也就是泰国的首座垃圾发电，现在也是我们投资的。那么的话呢，大家可以看到我们的国际业务，尽管现在规模不大，整个的装机，我们只占我们全部30个 GW 的装机的大概只有3%左右，但是呢，我们在过去的几年中发展的非常的平稳，也发展的非常的好。谢谢，下一页。那么这一页的话呢，是我们的一些投资的项目的一个简介。那么在这一页，我想告诉大家的一个主题是说，我们的这个合作伙伴非常的重要，也就是大家在右边看到的这个 logo。应该说我们在所有的项目里面，目前都有一些本土的合作伙伴，并且我们和他们保持了一个非常好的关系。那么正是这样的一种开放合作的这个态度，让我们不断的对于在英国乃至于在欧洲投资这个新能源项目的话呢，也变得这个越来越有信心。好的，下一页。我们在英国的业务主要是通过我们的红石能源投资公司去投资的。那么这个公司的话呢，是 base 在这个英国的爱丁堡。那么如果说从这个我们的雇员来看的话呢，我们在过去的5年中，我们的雇员是翻了3倍，也就是说现在的雇员大概是我们的全职加上我们的这个项目雇员的话呢，大概是将近有100人了。那么我们也是认为我们为当地的这个就业也是做出了贡献。那么同时的话呢，大家都知道，除了我们所关注的这个安全，那么的话呢，我们关注的这个社区的这样的一个需求的话呢，那么我们还特别的注重这个整个的这个能源趋势和的这个能源变革。那么这也是我们持续不断的对于像在英国或者是叫做西欧、北欧的这样的一个新能源产生浓厚投资兴趣，以及不断的实现一个又一个投资的最主要的这个动因。应该说所有的这些工作都是靠着我们在英国的这个团队所完成的。所以的话呢，我们北京只是作为这个控股股东层面上去管理。所以说从这样的一个角度的话呢，那么我们的在英国红石的所有的员工都为我们的过去几年的这样的一个不断的壮大和发展的话呢，是做出了巨大的努力和贡献的。那么这一点也是我们希望他们能够得到这个应有的赞赏。那么这个就是我简单的把我们国投电力目前正在英国开展的业务，或者在欧洲开展的新能源业务给大家做一个介绍，也希望在接下来的这个讨论环节和大家一起分享更多的关于中英投资的这样的一个信息和这个感想。谢谢。
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. That was very insightful and really interesting to see actually that your group's investment is actually already broader than just in the UK. You've already done what Adrian alluded to earlier, which is really embarking upon a fully global investment strategy, both in Southeast Asia you mentioned and elsewhere. So I don't know how many other Chinese companies there are that have been. Mr. Zhang, if you want to turn your video back on, so we can now have a kind of three-way conversation for the final 10 minutes of today's discussion. And
okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
And I think you said you would use English in this discussion part of things, but if you do want to revert to Chinese, then feel free.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess we've had an excellent example of a Chinese genco moving into both onshore and offshore or wind. And previously today, we heard from BP and oil and gas multinational also looking to to transition. How and this building of momentum that Adrian talked about, but is the momentum fast enough? Are these companies moving fast enough in order to hit the targets that we've got in front of us? You know, net zero, whatever that really means by 2050 or 2060 is ambitious. Adrian, Mr. Zhang, are power companies moving fast enough?
Mr. Zhang, would you like to go first?
Yes, of course. How to say, some of them countries move very fast to achieve that target. But what happened in the past several years, we in front of like extremely weather, not just this year, but also happened last year, like large scale of the heat wave in Greenland, and also flood in north part of Europe, and some forest fire in Australia and in United States, and also flood happened in China. So that means the climate change is not the rumors. It's coming. It's already coming. So some of the company move quite fast. Even we are not that big, but we are trying to contribute us more in this to deal with that. But for my personal view, I don't think that all the country move fast enough to deal with that. That's my short answer.
Thank you. Adrian, what would your take be on this?
Well, again, the short answer is no. A lot more needs to be done, but it's not easy. Certainly what you have at the moment with the whole ESG driver that's been amplified actually by COVID, I don't think anyone realized this, but it is a consequence, you know, the bizarre consequence of COVID too, that the green premium in the capital markets and in M&A is higher than ever. So, you know, there are a hell of a lot of organizations that are predicating the share price story on something that's green, and then renewables and offshore wind for energy companies is the easiest way, not that it's easy to do, but the clearest way, big scale way to show that you really are driving in the decarbonisation agenda. You know, hydrogen and CCUS will come, but right now, here and now, it's global offshore wind. So there's a lot of organizations chasing that, but to really be successful, it comes back to this point of scale, of capability, complexity, and capital, especially to capture the global opportunity, which is really where organizations need to be to deliver the lowest cost of energy. And I think so. And I think for China, really now the offshore wind space is just picking up in China. I mean, again, China is moving really fast domestically in offshore wind in terms of actually getting assets into the water in the last 12 months. So there is a big sort of question, I think, for Chinese SOEs. Do they focus on their domestic market, or do they compete alongside with, you know, the BPs, the Ørsteds, the RWEs that are globalizing as energy companies in big offshore wind? And of course, it's not going to be one or the other, and then it's about how the partnerships fit within that. But for Chinese companies, if they, you know, like Mr. Zhang, if he wants to keep that momentum going, those are the really big questions that will be coming, and they're really exciting questions.
And you mentioned the speed of construction of offshore wind farms in China in the last year in particular. Are European companies involved in this process, or I should say developers? Are we really seen much in the way? Or I think there's, you know, EDF, I think you mentioned, have been involved, but is that something that we should be watching? And if it hasn't happened, why has it not happened? Is the Chinese market open to them? Are they just not wanting to be investing in it, or what's the reason? What's the blockage, if there is one?
Mr. Zhang, would you like to go first?
Yes, maybe I come first. And of course, like Adrian just mentioned, the Chinese is extremely quick make quick progress in the offshore wind industry. And of course, the Chinese government don't have any obstacle for foreign investor to join this game. But given the large scales of investment and the quick or the rapid progress of the technical and the geology condition is quite different compared with the North Sea Europe. So there's some much differentiation between that. So maybe that's is also a challenge for European company to join in Chinese offshore wind market. But of course, I would like to say I hope that some European country can have some partner like what SDIC Power did in European market to find the real or the right person in local market cooperation and build the offshore wind. Maybe that's a successful way to do that. That's it.
Thank you. And what is there that UK companies and developers can learn from Chinese developers in this process, and vice versa? And is that happening from your experience, Adrian? And the deals and the companies that you've supported, have they been bringing different things to the table? The Chinese gencos versus the UK or European developers?
I mean, I think it's really nuanced, and it's not just one simple thing like here's a widget that that doesn't exist in China or something like that. So it's not as simple as that. I think it is much more nuanced, and I suppose at the other end of the scale, one thing that China probably doesn't need, is capital at the same time. So it's not just there's a lot to do, but we really need capital. Yes, of course, capital is always helpful, but more to share risk. I think there are developments of understanding what will happen with all of the energy. The European energy market, in particular in the UK, was one of the first markets to liberalise. We've had this movement now from the big six on retail into more disruptive retail companies. How will the Chinese energy market develop over time, and therefore how will the huge volumes of offshore wind that will be generated in China play into that market? So it's partnership around learning and lessons learned and more nuanced capability and business model. I think then coming back to partnership will come not just because a Chinese company needs a partner to deliver a 500 megawatt wind farm in China. Maybe the first one would be helpful, but certainly over time, that's not going to be the case. But it's going to be back to, is SDIC working with an international energy company in order to access another international market together in an auction, and therefore as part of an asset swap or a trade, it's helpful for that company then to come to China as well and to learn and for its overall business model and to share risk and reward. So I think it's some of those, it comes back to big partnership. And then the final point, the most important thing driving all of this is trust. EDF is in China because EDF has been working, probably for a generation now in China around nuclear, and was working originally with CGN, but now has relationships with other Chinese companies. And that's, I think, really where the oil and gas companies play very well. We've had BP on, Equinor, the oil and gas companies have been global for, again, generations, and they're in China. They've been in China for a long time. So, they will be very well placed, especially as they're building their offshore wind capabilities and acting more globally around, let's say, offshore wind tendering, to work with Chinese companies internationally and then in China in offshore wind. I'm very excited about it, but it won't happen overnight, and it will be more nuanced than we just need a bit of capital or we just need a particular piece of the supply chain. I think it'll be more strategic.
Thanks, Adrian. We've had a question in which is at once specific and also incredibly broad, and I'm conscious that we're basically up at time, but just a quick one, Mr. Zhang, which was whether or not the Chinese issues for connecting offshore wind generation into their domestic grid have been resolved. Is that something that you could speak to quite?
Sorry, come again, because of the better signal.
The question was around whether or not the challenges that they had in connecting offshore wind into the domestic Chinese grid have been resolved, but maybe we can answer that after the session in writing if it's not something that can be addressed quickly.
Yeah,
maybe that's what we'll do.
Yeah.
That's fine. I'm conscious not to overrun. It's been a really interesting discussion. We have other questions which we will answer after this in writing, and thanks to those that have put them in the Q&As. And sorry, we haven't got the time to address them all right now. But thank you very much, Adrian and Mr. Zhang, for joining this discussion, and thanks to all of the participants who've been listening in from China and UK and elsewhere. There will be another 4 of these webinars as part of our build up to COP26. The first of those will be next Wednesday, the 22nd, which is looking at the second theme of adaptation and resilience. And then there's another one next Thursday on clean transportation. At the end of the month, green finance, and then into October we'll have one on nature-based solutions. So, and then the report that we're drafting will be launched at physical events in Guangzhou on October 28th, Beijing November 4th, and Glasgow November 9th. And details of how to join all of those will be shared in due course. Thanks again to all of our speakers from the first panel and the second panel, and to all of you for joining us this morning and this evening. And thanks to our interpreters for doing a great job. Have a great day. Bye now.